Good afternoon, and very welcome to this seminar entitled Russian State Memory Wars, a conversation with Sergei Lebedev. My name is Martin Kragh. I'm the deputy head of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, and it is my great pleasure and honor to moderate today's event. I have just one small note to remark, which is that if you have any questions that you want to pose to the panelists, please write them in the chat function, or if you are following this on Facebook, please write them there. For introduction, I will also give the word to my co-panelist and colleague, Stefan Ingvarsson.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'll give a short background to Sergei. It's a pleasure having you back in Stockholm, because even though we're sitting in different rooms, we're all actually at the same place right now, which is unusual and great. Sergei has a background in geology and geological expeditions, which is important for his writing and for his method. He also has a background in investigative journalism and editorial work. And all of this was before he made his debut as a novelist with the novel Oblivion in 2010, Russian original. The debut is published in Sweden under the title Vid glömskans rand. In total, the author of 5 novels. The last one out right now is Untraceable. Untraceable will also appear in Swedish later this fall under the title Debutant, which is also a title used in many other languages. And it's due at the end of October, so please make a note of that. And the New York Review of Books calls him the best of Russia's younger generation of writers. And I think with that praise, I'll hand over the word to you, Sergei.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody who are online with us, who are together this day to listen about the Russia state memory wars. It's a quite a broad topic. Because Russia is waging these wars on a very different fronts. So first I will stick to the latest statements made on this front, and then I will try to generalize a bit why it happens and for what reason it happens. Just tomorrow morning, the general prosecutor of Russia said that there is a need for extra legislation which will aim to prohibit the spread of Nazi ideology in Russia, to prohibit any sort of praise for the Nazism and so on. A few days ago, the foreign minister of Russian Federation, Mr. Lavrov, whom probably everybody know, was meeting with the veterans, the former soldiers of the World War II in the city of Volgograd, former Stalingrad, and the very place is very significant. And he also made a statement that the attacks on Stalin, the attempts to describe him as an absolute evildoer, are the part of the foreign-inspired attacks of Russia on Russia itself. So the ideological subversion goes, let's say, through the past. A few months before Russian President, Mr. Putin, wrote quite an extensive article, not on the history of Russia, but on the history of Ukraine, which he claimed barely does not exist as a nation, as a state, but is sort of invention made again by the foreign inspirators with an aim to make a split between the two brother nations. It's quite an intensive account of just few months, and we can clearly see that the Russian policy making of the current moment is very deeply linked and very deeply rooted into the history, which is a little bit strange and not common, I would say, in the modern world. If to elaborate a bit on that, it would be interesting to compare of how the modern Russia and USSR, the Soviet Union, placed themselves or placing themselves within the history and time. If we'll speak about the Soviet Union in the full length of its existence, it had very distinctive relationship towards the future and towards the past. The Soviet Union project was aimed to the future and was borrowing its legitimization from the future. The future was a source of legitimate rule, while the past, the imperial past, the past in general, was the source of explanations why we had some problems, why we have so many wrongdoings, why we are still not in the desired future. We can even say that the whole Soviet idea was the idea to overcome the past, to overcome it totally, and to erase any trace of the past within the fabric of society. Of course, certain aspects of the past were instrumentalized and were treated with a sort of respect, especially when it goes to the military history and to the certain aspect of the Russian imperial colonialism. But the general arrow of intentions, of the political intentions and political culture, was aimed to the future. When we are speaking about the Russia today, we clearly see the very opposite picture. The future of the Russian Federation is not widely discussed. It's quite an uncertain thing, this future, while the past is the source of the legitimization for the current regime. The past is no more the vogue area of the wrongdoings. The past is the glorious golden age. The past is the time when the foundations were laid, and most importantly, I would say the storage of morale, the storage of feeling of the moral rightness was established and preserved, from where we are still borrowing this feeling of the moral rightness to rule and to judge. This is quite different approaches, and the last one, I would say explains the intensity and nervosity when it comes to the issues of the past within the current Russian policies. And it's important to say that these articles, these laws are not just the statements, are not just the smoke screen used to avoid, to attract attention of the people and from the, let's say, domestic problems. This is something more serious, sinister, and dangerous. And one particular case, one particular trial, one particular story which lasts already for 5 years can prove it very well. We will later talk about this story within the possible time with all the possible details, but just to mark it, this is the story of Karelian Gulag researcher Yuri Dmitriev, who was arrested 5 years ago under the false, I'm quite sure this, under the false charges, but the real aim of arrest was to stop his work on memory of the Stalinist repressions in Russia and within the Karelia. And the very spot we are talking about, the place of memory which he created, the place called Sandermoch, will also guide us through all the entanglements and all the conflicts of the Russian state memory wars. Yep.
Sergei, could we elaborate a little bit on 2014 and the Russian aggression in Ukraine as a game changer in how the current Russian regime has been using historical memory?
Yes, of course. First of all, it's important to make a small description what we are talking about when we are talking about the Sandermoch. We have, I think, around 150 well-known places of the mass executions from the Great Terror of 1937, but they are all in a very different stages of development. And Sandermoch is very important and very rare example of how such a place could be developed by the forces, by the civic movements, and within the direct state control.
You mean developed as a site of memory?
Developed as a site of memory and as a long-lasting memory project. Just to make it clear, Sandermoch is a place on the north of Karelia, where in 1937 around 10,000 people, mostly the prisoners of the notorious Solodetsky camp, were brought in and executed in a quite short period of time. For the Soviet statistics, they were all just the prisoners, but actually they were of absolutely different origin. In Sandermoch, we have around 60 representatives of around 60 nations buried there. And what is most important, around 1,000 of these people were the Ukrainian political, cultural elite, the writers, the theater directors, the politicians, the historians. The full list of their names is longer than 2 screens in Wikipedia. And all of them, I would say, have the Wikipedia references. So you can imagine that for Ukraine, this is a very special and distinctive place of memory. And Dmitriev offered quite a new model for such a places, because usually you have one monument, you have one wall with all the names written on it, with any sort of distinctions, who is from where. He offered the different model. Sandermoch is a forest where you have this execution ditches, and he introduced sort of forest of memory, with the different names placed on the trees, with the different personal monuments erected, and he barely forced, or at least invited, the local national diasporas to erect their own national monuments. For nowadays, we have 17 of them. 17 or 18 republics of the Soviet Union, 17 monuments, so it's quite a lot. And these monuments became the center of the activity for the national diasporas within Russia and for the nations outside of the borders of Russia. There were diplomats coming to commemorate their compatriots. There were a huge delegation of the foreigners coming to this with the same aim. And of course, for some period, it was okay for the local state. But then imagine the summer 2014. Russian troops are in an advance in Ukraine. It's a bloody war going on. And in Sandermoch, every summer, they had a commemoration ceremony on the August 5th, because on August 5th, 1937, the executions started. And in 2014, Dmitriev, of course, Dmitriev was the main figure who organized this, who linked all these different delegations and different people together. He got quite a clear advice not to invite Ukrainian delegation anymore, because it would have been too much sharp, too much political. In the moment, again, when the Russian troops are clearly on the Ukrainian territory and they are killing Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian servicewomen and civilians. He refused. He clearly refused, and he gave very brave, open speech there, meaning, I cannot quote the exact words, but I would say that I would correctly deliver the meaning, that those who killed people here in Sandermark thought that their deeds would be clandestine forever, that nobody will trace these victims and they will go unknown and unnoticed. The history gives us a lesson when we are standing here in Sandermark. It never happened. We found them, we brought them names and so on. And he meant that those who are waging war in Ukraine also thinks that their crimes will be unnoticed and the mass graves will be never found. And he said it's not true. Of course, this was a big problem for the local state officials, a big problem for the local state security, I would say. And since then, I think they started to try to find the ways to get rid of him. And they withdrawn quite soon all the forms of support for these events. I mean, you need some technique, you need audio apparatus and so on. And in 2 years, in December 2016, after several attempts to shut him down and to prohibit the Ukrainians to come here, to come to Sandermark, he was arrested. And from this moment starts another story, another side or another path of the real, I would say, memory wars, when the whole machine of the state is aimed on the person who had shown defiance.
Sergei, the way that this warfare within history is fought is very different, and maybe to broaden the perspective from Sandermark, we could juxtapose it with another place of memory, with a different perpetrator in a different context, and that is Babi Yar in Ukraine, the site of mass killings of Jews in Ukraine made by the Nazi occupation army, where Russia also has a big involvement, and where maybe the Russian involvement in these disputes is even trickier to talk about, because of course Babi Yar is a very important, it's very important to show that the Holocaust is something more than Auschwitz. It's also Babi Yar, and it's also something very important in Ukrainian history. Yet here we can see the subtlety of these wars. How would you even touch upon this subject, which is so difficult?
Yeah, I will make a risk, because it's really very sensitive and very tricky thing, not as even more complicated than the Sandermark story. 80 years ago, in autumn of 1941, German forces occupied Kiev, the largest city of Ukraine, the capital of Ukraine, and quite soon Einsatzkommandos, with a certain, as I remember, help of the local collaborators, gathered the Jews of the Kiev city and executed them in 3 or 4 days in a ravine, in a big ravine on the shore of Dnieper River, which was called and still called Babi Yar. Then we are coming to the Soviet period of history and the Soviet wrongdoings, I would say, because in the Soviet tradition, Holocaust was never openly expressed or revealed. This was the story of the peaceful Soviet citizens killed by the Nazis. Jews were never named. Some of the local activists already in the 60s and 70s demanded the erection of the monuments, especially to the Jews. The territory is immensely big and it's very difficult terrain because it's a ravine, it's full of forests, bushes, and so on. So during the Soviet period, few monuments were made just in the beginning of the ravine. So only the small part of the territory, I would say, have been memorialized and memorialized within the Soviet tradition. No mention of Jews, just a massacre against the unknown Soviet citizens. Later, of course, when Ukraine gained its independence, immediately there were a lot of talks how the memory project should have been developed there. Yet the ravine itself was a little bit frozen in the time. Certain projects, like to commemorate Roma who were also executed there, or to commemorate some other minor groups within the whole mess, were erected, moved, then disappeared. And only after the 2014, after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the whole story started to develop in a very strange way. The current project of the memorial in Babi Yar, very modern, very well developed in terms of historiography, yet is financed and pushed by the Russian oligarch, who is well known for its links to Kremlin. On one hand, all these oligarchs are Jews, and they argue that it's their personal story. Some of them have their relatives executed in the Babi Yar. So you cannot avoid these personal links. But on the other hand, quite a part of his Ukrainian historical society are arguing that it's a little bit dangerous to handle the whole story and to get the Russian money to be involved on such a scale, because the project is a project and you never know how it will be handled later. And of course, from a certain perspective, we can see that it could be a clever play, because one of the main ideological motives of Kremlin towards Ukraine was to blame and stigmatize Ukrainians as a Nazi supporters. The Nazism as a word, as a notion, appeared immediately during the Maidan revolution of 2013-2014. And until onwards, Kremlin invested a lot to depict, especially the Ukrainian, let's say, Maidan movement, as the movement which arose from the hidden Nazi structures and which borders different marginalized parties which are clearly Nazi. And this approach is very well rooted in the Soviet depiction of the Ukrainian resistance after the World War II. Ukrainians were clearly blamed to be the Nazi collaborators, even though they haven't been clear Nazi collaborators. And this is the very strange story to see in its development, because on the other hand, as you told, the such place as a Babi Yar should be commemorated, because it clearly shows that the eastern borders of the Holocaust, eastern territories of the Holocaust, are far more to the east than Poland, and even Kiev is not its most eastern dot on the map. But on the other hand, you see how the money money and Russian influence are trying to infiltrate these projects and to gain certain control on their essence. We'll see how this project will elaborate, but at least Russian involvement and Russian control is raising certain alarms, and the possibility that Ukrainians would be disproportionately blamed for being the perpetrators of the Babi Yar. At least this point of view are well spread among the Ukrainian historians, I would say.
Thank you very much. I'm stressing that this meeting is open to questions from all of you, and the introduction is, so to say, finished. But thank you for giving us these two examples, because maybe in Sandemoch, from our perspective, things are a bit clear about what should be done and who's obstructing what. And whereas in Babi Yar, we can see the complexity in the other end. Thank you very much. If there aren't any questions coming in right now, I would like to just propose a third site then, that from the very beginning was a site maybe of exemplary dealing with difficult Soviet past, but that has then been altered. And that's the commemoration site of Katin outside of Smolensk, the place of execution of Polish officers. If you could just very briefly say something, and then maybe we'll add this as just a third site of a very concrete manifestation of this conflict.
Yeah, so again, after the Soviet invasion to Poland, 1939, a great amount of the Polish officers and the Polish civil servants were brought to the camps in a Soviet Union, into the different camps in the different places with a name to separate them a little bit from each other. And then in 1940, it was an order to execute them all. And the most notorious, most well-known of the places of execution, yet not the only one, is the Katin place near Smolensk. This place was before used by the local state security as an execution ground, so the part of those who were executed there earlier and after are the Soviet political prisoners. But let's say the main bulk are the Polish officers. While when Germans invaded Soviet Union, they found the spot quite early, and it was revealed and used by the German propaganda machine as a clear example of the Bolsheviks' brutality. When the Soviets conquered the land back, they made a clear attempt to attribute these atrocities back to Germans. And even Soviets made an attempt to bring this accusation to the Nuremberg trial, which they were denied, actually. But all during the Soviet period, the version was very firm. These were the Germans who executed the Poles there. And even in the late 80s, this was the last, let's say, mystery, last story to stand firm. But then, under the Gorbachev, I think, the real documents were opened, the archives were opened, and the Polish side was given the full picture of what happened there, including the accounts of the Soviet Commission who attributed this crime to Germans. And Polish side built a very good and very strong memorial there. I had a very special attitude to this memorial because I was traveling a lot via Moscow to Berlin and back by the car. And when you are there, you remind all the names of the Polish cities which you are passing by in the car. They are all there on the memorial plaques of the Polish officers. But then, I would say in the early years of the Putin era, the story started to change a bit. First of all, the whole ground was brought under the umbrella of the Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Church was erected, even though we clearly understand that Polish officers were not Orthodox, they were mostly Catholics. And second, while the tensions between the Russia and Poland were growing, the Russian side started to bring to attention the other part of the Polish-Russian relationship, the story of the unsuccessful assault of the Soviet forces against the Poland in 1920. As a result of this assault, a lot of the Soviet soldiers, more than 100,000, I think, were kept prisoners of war in the Polish camps. The different account exists, but we understand that certain percent of them died there because they were not treated like 100% according to all the international regulations. So the Russian side started to emphasize this story in a way to explain the Katin as a retribution or retaliation from the Soviet side to the Poles who committed the same atrocities before. So just near the entrance to the Polish memorial site were installed the special stands where all this story of 1920 were described in details, and these stands and the text of them are growing from year to year, I would say, gathering more and more attention from the tourists. At the same time, the Polish side were denied visas to visit the other Polish memorial sites, and the local authorities in the different places of Russia and other places of execution for the Polish officers started quite a well-coordinated attack to remove the Polish memorial plaques from the different monasteries, for example, because some of the monasteries were used as temporary concentration camps and so on. And finally, in the other part in Mednoya, near that Tver, again, the investigation was opened with an idea to prove that maybe certain amount of the bodies there are yet the German victims, not the Soviet one. And we clearly see here, first of all, the absolute inheritance of the Soviet practices, and second, the very clear idea that you can negotiate the modern moment, you can negotiate the modern policies through the back door of the past. If something is wrong in the modern moment, you have this certain amount of hostages, I would say, who are buried in your soil, who are yours forever. And there is no way for the Polish side or for whatever side to defend them for 100%. They are still kept in the captivity. And you, as a state, can do with them whatever you want, and even rewrite their identities, for example.
Martin, do you have any questions coming in?
Absolutely. We had a few interesting questions. Two of them are sort of overlapping. It regards, the purpose of this history politics or politics of history. Apart from nationalist movements or to have to support the idea of a Russian glorious past, could there be any other motives that you see behind these policies to instrumentalize history?
I would say that the Soviet Union can be seen from one, I would say, quite a special perspective as a conflict-producing machine. During its existence, it produced and kept in a, let's say, frozen state a lot of conflicts with the bordering neighbors, with the nations within itself, and they are very different in their essence. For example, some Soviet nations were absolutely and totally deported to the far remote places of Siberia or Kazakhstan. Then they were returning back in the 60s and 80s. For example, it goes to the Crimean Tatars. But now the Crimean Tatars are one of the most long-standing proponents of the Crimea as a part of Ukraine. And definitely all the sources possible will be used to blacken them, as they were blackened in the Soviet Union, as Nazi collaborators. But now there is another flaw possible, because they are Muslims. In the Soviet times, it was not possible to accuse the whole nation of being of the wrong religion or something like that, because everybody was expected to be the non-believer or something like this. But now it's possible to also mark them as a possible extremists or the terrorists and so on. So now we have, in this case, we have the former Soviet accusations and the modern day accusations working together. And if we will dig deeper in any case of what is happening now, we will find some practical reason for this to be done. And in general, as I told, it would be the question of the national policies or some national state to be involved in the former Soviet sphere of influence and losing its citizens due to the actions of the Soviet government. But of course, the second, I would say, the second reason could be the general idea, which also is inherited from the Soviet Union. During the Stalinist period, the enemy, the class enemy, was always within the society. It was the part of the society, and the aim was to get rid of it. But in the late Soviet Union, enemy always was outside. Within the society, only the anti-Soviet elements existed, inspired or influenced by the generalized West. And now, given the law against the foreign agents, given the whole activity around the foreign money coming to Russia to support NGOs and so on, we can also regard the memory wars as a way to maintain this fever, as a way to maintain this general mood of animosity towards the West, the general mood that we are in war, and anytime the West is trying to undermine something important in our country.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions that actually came in, so let's bring them up. There was one question from Hans Gunnar Adén regarding Putin's quite recent article, I think from maybe 1 or 2 years ago, where he penned the blame for the outbreak of World War II on Poland, accusing them of treachery. What is your take on this attempt to create a new interpretation of the Second World War?
Now we come to the, let's say, the elephant in the room, because of course the cult of the Great Patriotic War, not the Second World War, is the main foundation for the current regime of Mr. Putin and for the whole construction of the Russian state. Why it happened so? Because I think that, as I told, the current Russia is seeking for the legitimization within the past, not within the future. And if we take this 20th century of the Russian history, we clearly see that there is only one moment which can be used as a such foundation. And actually, we would say that in sociological terms, the World War II created or recreated the Soviet Union, which collapsed in the 1991, when the last generation of frontoviki, the veterans, left the political scene, and both Yeltsin and Gorbachev and all their entourage were the first generation not to be involved in war directly. So when Mr. Putin is claiming that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, he's talking about the Soviet Union, which was created by the World War II. He was born in the Soviet Union, created by the World War II. He was provided with the training and the whole set of ideas of the state security officers within the Soviet Union, created by the World War II. And of course, the World War II in this sense is a sort of reload, the last, like in a computer game or something like this, it's the last point where you can go back and reload the whole game. And it looks like that he and his advisors, or this group of thinkers, they are constantly trying to reload or reset the whole system and to start from this point. It's impossible, but yet they are still in this within this attempt.
We spoke before the seminar a bit about another site in relation to this, which was quite discussed in Russian media at the time, maybe 2 years ago. The start to build, and then now it's finished, the Russian Orthodox Church of the Armed Forces, which was created outside of Moscow. A huge undertaking. It cost a lot of money, and it represents the grandeur not only of Russian Orthodoxy but also its military, the military achievements of Russia and the Soviet Union. Can you say a little bit about this, and perhaps for the listeners who haven't seen the pictures, if you can also give a short description of the place?
Okay, it's a real challenge for the writer to describe this thing. It's important to say that it's for a long period, this territory where the church been erected was a training territory for the army. It's located west of Moscow, directly on the main axis of the German advance during the winter of 1941. And the very site where the church is built is more or less close to the former front line where the German advance were formally and last stopped. So we clearly see that the gravity of the World War II are symbolically used in this way. It was the former tank testing ground where, let's say, the armored might of the Red Army was born, tested, developed, and so on. So this is, let's say, glorious grounds. Nearby is located the most famous tank museum in Russia, with all the display of this armored symbols of might and power and so on. So it's already was well developed in a sense of military ideology. A few years before the church, the whole area was claimed to be the educational park called Patriot, with an idea that the Muscovites with their children or their children within their school groups will go there to shoot, to eat some military food, and to go through the series of the smaller museums to learn a lot about the patriotic deeds of their grandfathers. It was also the part of the new military project, which is called Junarmia, the young army, the replacement movement for the pioneeria of the Soviet period. Now it is more than 1 million strong, and it's clearly developing. So, and as the, let's say, metaphysical center of this whole ground aimed for the patriotic education was built a church. I would say a church as a place for the spiritual transformation. Even though this spiritual transformation would have been very strange, because the church itself is immense. It's around the size of the St. Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow. So it's a really big thing, colored more or less in the hockey colors of the military uniform, and the parts of it are made, or at least the architect claims that they are made of the barrels or some other military metal from the captured German machines. Within the church, it was a strange mosaic depicting all the Soviet military leaders like coming, staying, and praying together, including Mr. Putin himself. So as you told, partly the infrastructure of the church would have been considered sort of a blasphemy inside the Western tradition. But here we clearly see the role of the church, which is not the religious role. The current Russian Orthodox Church is just serving as an ideological department of the KPSU, because there is no official, like, firm, strict ideology, and the Russian state is more flexible and more instrumental than the Soviet one was. But the essence of this approach, or this idea, is to mark the certain spaces within the ideology and history as a sacred ones. And when you mark them as a sacred ones, you gain the possibility to blame the others that they are violating this sacredness. And this is important thing which they are doing. The church itself is instrumental, but they are reconstructing this certain areas, or let's say no-go zones, where it should be no questions. And it's important to add that, of course, these no-go zones are protected by the law. For example, one of the recent laws was the law prohibiting any form of comparison, any dangerous form of comparison between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So you cannot equal them. You cannot put the sign of equality between Stalin and Hitler, for example. You should always make a reference that, of course, there is some similarities, but.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions, and I actually like to pick them up. There's one who is asking about the space for Russian journalists, historians, and writers today inside Russia. What is the space? What are the possibilities to write on sensitive or unexplored topics of Russia's past?
Okay, there are very few independent media still standing. So, of course, there are some, let's say, naturreservat, where you can still publish a certain account. But in general, I will give like a short description. 20 years ago, when you were in the bookshop, you had a full shelf, like 5 or 6 stories high, filled with the good historical books. And on the lowest shelf near the floor, it was 4 or 5 or 6 with the red-brown jackets, like describing the Stalin as a good leader, Mr. Beria as a very good manager who managed to establish a nuclear project. So this was the proportion. Now it's quite vice versa. You have immense quantity of these trash books which depicts the Soviet leaders as the great leaders, and somewhere on the lowest shelf you will see the great research books. They're still printed, they are still available in the shops, but they are not visible. The mainstream, the main thing is going in the other direction, I would say.
Another related question is the role of art and literature in particular in confronting these tendencies. I mean, you are one of the authors in today's Russia who actually also explore these issues in literature. Is that an alternative space for people who want to have a more reflective view on the past?
I would say that it would have been an alternative space, but mainly the Russian artists are not willing to go and to explore these topics. The freedom of art is always an excuse. You cannot force people to write what they are not willing to write, but yet when you are looking over the general picture, the picture in its entirety, you see sort of a tendency that the modern history, Russia exists already for 30 years. It's quite a time. The modern history is a bit neglected. I always bring an example. The first Chechen war started 25 years ago, quarter of a century. I think it's already a time to make some reflections of it, and especially reflections in the literary form, and especially given the great tradition of the Russian literature to write on Caucasus. I mean, it's a Leo Tolstoy, it's Mikhail Lermontov, it's the other round of names less known, but there is no texts. I mean, there are Arkady Babchenko, there are Anna Politkovskaya, one novel of Vladimir Makanin, but it should have been an array of them. No, they're simply not present. And this is also, for me, sort of the evidence that the irresponsibility and the absence of the responsibility is transferred from the Soviet society into the Russian one. And the literature is, in this case, is just a part of the general agreement that we, the non-spoken agreement, that we shouldn't mess too much with the crimes of the state. We shouldn't raise these questions about the responsibility and the criminals as they were not raised in the late 80s, early 90s, as they were not raised in the moment when we were commemorating the victims of the Stalinist repressions, but were never openly and publicly asked, and who committed these repressions? Who is responsible? And this irresponsibility goes in the modern days, because I do respect the personal bravery of Alexei Navalny. But look, his main agenda is corruption, as it was, for example, in the late 80s, when the general perestroika movement was headed by the crusaders against the nomenclatura privileges and corruption. But the problem of the current Russian state is not that it's corrupted. The problem is in different things, because of their hands are in the blood and the Russian troops are on Ukrainian soil. But nobody will say this publicly.
That's an interesting reflection. If you look back, I mean, throughout, if you take any sort of adult in today's Russia, I mean, the state of Russia and before its predecessor state, Soviet Union, was involved in Afghanistan for 1 decade, then in Chechnya twice, and a few other smaller wars before that in Nagorno-Karabakh and Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Transnistria, and then there was Georgia and Ukraine under Putin. Do you think, do you sense that this history of sort of constant militarism is what has been at the root of Russia's political problems today?
I would say briefly that the modern Russian regime, of course, was born and developed itself during the Chechen wars. The Chechnya was the polygon. The Chechnya transformed deeply the Russian state security agencies and the Russian army. I would say it deeply changed its morale. All what we are looking upon now, this anonymized police raiding the apartments, this unjust arrests, these raid campaigns, this brutality, it was all what happened in Chechnya first. But nobody cared. I mean, not of course nobody, but general population didn't pay attention. And this is the price we are paying now for being so dismissal to what was going on just 1,500 kilometers southeast from Moscow.
Since we're running out of time, Sergei, I always remember one thing that you told me when Svetlana Alexievich got the Nobel Prize and I called you, and you said the greatness of Svetlana Alexievich is that her books contain the next century of Russian literature. They contain, in short, the blueprints for all the novels that should be written and all the plays that should be staged in Russian theaters. And this, I always keep this in mind. And just going back to literature, your novel that is Swedish will be called Debutant in Nils Håkansson's translation. Deals it. I mean, this for the first time you've entered the genre of a spy thriller, but it has a very specific origin. And if we could just use the last minutes in maybe giving your future readers around the world an insight into where it all started, the story, that you actually started looking at the poisoning with untraceable or supposedly untraceable poisons of defected spies in the West.
Actually, I was for a long period looking for the modern topic to write on, but I was waiting for the sort of a call, sort of a signal for me to understand that it's something personal, it's my mission, it's not just a topic among the other topics. And a few days after the assassination of Skripals in England in 2018, I spotted one important detail. The Western media reported that the nerve agent, which was probably used, was produced in a military closed city in Russia called Shikhane. Nobody paid attention, but for me it was an alarm bell, because from my previous research, which I made for my novel about Russian Germany, I knew what Shikhane is. Shikhane was established in late 1920s as a secret joint facility of Weimar Republic and the Soviet Union, because the Germans were prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles to develop certain types of the warfare, and the chemical warfare was the top on the list. So I realized that the Novichok is not just a thing from nowhere. It's not just the newborn baby of the chemical industry. It has a very long shadow which goes into the past. The shadow which links the modern day with the most darkest decades of the European history, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. And I realized that it's a good starting point to write the novel which traces, I would say, the genealogy of evil, of how the evil is produced, born, and distributed.
Thank you very much. Martin, closing word from you.
Well, I think it's difficult to top this finish by Sergei Lebedev, and I would like to thank both of you very much, Sergei and Stefan, for your insightful comments, and I think all of you, all of us who follow this, either as attendees or panelists, have greatly benefited from this discussion. So thank you very much, and we send you our heartfelt thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.